So hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's great to be here with you today. I'd like to start just by talking about a beautiful land with green rolling hills. Maybe you can picture some sheep dotting the countryside, some ruddy-faced villagers with Guinness in their hands. If you're thinking about what's often called the Emerald Isle of Ireland, that is the place where my husband and I actually lived for over 10 years and got to experience and can say that it is indeed a beautiful country, a beautiful land with beautiful people. However, there is a darker side to Ireland that maybe some of you know about, which started in the 1990s when the government actually issued a report saying that over the course of decades, Catholic priests had abused children sexually in the churches. And so they actually tried to cover up the sexual abuse to protect the diocese's reputation, but the government of Ireland actually came forward and brought it out into the public and also said that the inquiry showed clearly that a systemic, calculated perversion of power and trust was visited on helpless and innocent children in the archdiocese. And so there was a breach of trust there, and this led to a decline in mass service attendance and also a rise in skepticism regarding the church's historical power and authority in Ireland. So there's nothing new under the sun, you might say. And this has certainly proved true throughout history with regard to systems of power or corrupt hierarchy and its exploitative nature. So this has happened not just in the Catholic Church, but also in the government and other denominations of churches throughout the world. And we're going to see exploitative power demonstrated in actually the David and Bathsheba story as well in 2 Samuel 11. So the Bathsheba story, a lot of times people say, or maybe you've heard it taught in churches, that basically it's about David and he sinned sexually, and so did Bathsheba, and we don't need to sin sexually. You know, maybe that's kind of the message. But today we're going to talk a little bit differently about David and his reign as king and also the exploitative power that he used during that reign. And so we'll start with 2 Samuel 11, verse 1, if you'd like to read along. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messages to her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanliness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house and eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. So 2 Samuel is actually found within what's called the succession narrative. So the larger context of that is just that it's about David as king and also Solomon, his son, succeeding him as king after him. And some biblical scholars have also found that, though most the Old Testament tends to portray David in a very positive light, sort of in a glowing manner, a great king, 2 Samuel 11 and 12 actually portray him in a little bit different way, in a way that actually promotes skepticism about his kingly authority. So the text is painting a picture of rulership as a hierarchical exploitative system that fails to protect and defend the people and often exploits them instead. This skepticism about power is not unlike that of the Irish Catholic priests toward the children in Ireland, since they don't attend Mass anymore. That's due to their skepticism about the power in Catholic Church. Also, we can consider the US and the government, the federal government, and look at maybe statistics on how America views the US government. If we look at a graph provided by the Pew Research Center, it actually shows that between 1958 and 64, kind of the approval rating, really, if you will, of the trust about the American government was around 73 to 77%. By 2020, it was down to about 20%. And also, of that, 36% actually now say that the government is doing a good job of helping people escape poverty. And so essentially that's showing us that the US doesn't trust government to take care of the vulnerable and the exploited in our society. And so how about you? Do you trust that our government is doing a good enough job to help the vulnerable and exploited of our society? Or do you tend to think that most of the powerful in government, maybe even in other institutions of power, not only fail to help their citizens, but actually exploit them instead? So how about David? He was also in a position of power, the powerful king of Israel at the time. And how was he exploiting the powerless in the narrative? So we'll see today that he actually did this in two ways. So the first one is that he did not act on behalf of justice. So this would be like the sin of omission, if you will. And then the other one is actually that when he did act, he acted in a bad or exploitative way, which would be, the sin of commission for that one. So the first, he did not act for justice. In a tone that sounds almost satirical in verse 1, right? It talks about the time when kings go out to battle. And so David sends out Joab, he sends out his officers, he actually sends out, the scripture says, all of Israel, but he himself actually didn't go out to battle. He didn't go out to fight. And so the text is implicating David on two fronts. First by saying that it was a time when all the kings go out to battle, David didn't go out. And then also when they said all, they implicated him because it said all of Israel actually went out to fight except for David. David actually stayed at home during that time. So he didn't act for justice. We have examples of power today as well that have not acted on behalf of justice when they had the chance, the sin of omission. So the Southern Baptist Church, there was a cover-up that's still an ongoing investigation that covered up sexual abuse and exploitation for years. And Terry Gross from NPR actually said that in May of this year, a report was issued confirming that survivors who came forward alleging they were sexually abused by church leaders were either ignored, silenced, or they were often misaligned or disparaged when they did come forward. So meanwhile, the church kept a list of over 700 offenders, and this was a secret list that they didn't actually release to the public. And so when they had the chance to act on behalf of the exploited, as the powerful, they didn't act for them. And they didn't act for justice, which is just what David did. Also, David, when he did act, he acted exploitatively. So the text continues in 11:2, and it seems that he was a peeping Tom, right, who would rather actually take a nap than go into battle, and he actually decides to check out Bathsheba in the verse, who we find bathing. And she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who also incidentally has gone out to fight for David in battle. So David decides to take advantage of the situation while Uriah is away and he's not in battle. And he takes action, but it's an exploitative bad action. And actually there's two actions here. So the first one, he sends for her. There's three. He asks about her, the first action. The second, he sends for her. And then the third one, he sleeps with her, which is the worst one. So we might pause here just to remember a passage about a king of Israel, and when Israel didn't have any king yet. And so they actually demanded a king. They said, we want a king just like all the other nations. And so the prophet Samuel actually comes to them and he warns them. He prophesies that they will have abuses of power that come to them if they do get a king. And these were from 1 Samuel 8, verse 11 through 13. 1 was economic exploitation, 2 was taxation, and 3 was oppression. And so Israel may have said, we want a king because they desire somebody to rule over them and protect them and give them all of their needs. But actually, this passage is just confirming the prophecy that Samuel said. So he was exploiting and he was oppressing his citizens, the very ones that he was supposed to protect, as King David was meant to do. And how many times also have we seen this in modern day history, right? So we've seen it now with the Catholic Church, we've seen it with the Southern Baptist Church. American citizens, we hear, and other citizens throughout the world are raising voices against the very things that Samuel prophesied. Let's review them again. Samuel prophesied economic exploitation, taxation, and also oppression. Human trafficking, forced prostitution still abound within and without our borders. The OHCHR also said that these are on their rise amongst children. So is the government doing enough to eradicate these things? Or what about other hierarchical power structures that do have power to do something about it? And the Catholic Church abuse, again, of children did not only occur in Ireland. The Catholic Church also in the USA, there was a Church Commission report in 2004 that said that more than 4,000 US Roman Catholic priests had faced sexual abuse allegations in the last 50 years. This is in America, in cases involving more than 10,000 children, mostly boys. And we remember again that within religious institutions of power, exploitation was not just concerned with the Catholic Church, right? We saw it in the Southern Baptist system. So basically, in essence, we can't say that hierarchical systems in the church are necessarily less exploitative than governmental or other hierarchical organizations or systems of power. And nor are they denominational, and nor are they isolated in one geographic area. So really, we can say then, what is the ultimate problem? It would be the hierarchy itself, right? The hierarchical system of power that sort of even in of itself naturally becomes seemingly exploitative over time. So the echelons of power today, such as government, churches, and others, are just like 1 Samuel 11 is describing. And they fail to act on behalf of justice when needed, so the sin of omission. And also when they do act, they act in an exploitative manner instead, in their own interests. So again, just like we said in Ecclesiastes, nothing is new under the sun. It's happened over and over. So who is going to bring about justice against this exploitative system? Is it government or institutions? No, we know that now. It is God. So we'll look at Psalm 73 for a moment, just to see that God is actually just towards the powerful, because the psalmist is actually sending up a lament about the prosperity of the wicked, and he says that they have no struggles, their bodies are fat and sleek, they're not plagued by human ills that the vulnerable and the poor and rejected of society have. They have pride as their necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. Their mouths lay claim to heaven, and their tongues take possession of the earth. They threaten oppression, so they oppress those that maybe they should try to help if they're rich or to protect. This is what the wicked are like, always free of care. They go on amassing wealth. So they continue to amass wealth instead of helping the poor. And often they get their wealth from exploiting the poor and the vulnerable citizens of the world too. But it says, when the psalmist says, when I tried to understand all of this, it troubled me deeply till I entered the sanctuary of God. Then I understood their final destiny. Surely you place them on slippery ground. You cast them down to ruin. How suddenly are they destroyed, completely swept away by terrors. So really you can kind of see this as a bigger picture, talking about exploitation and talking about that sin. And that it says that the psalmist is rejoicing finally at the end of the passage after his lament, because he sees that God is a God of justice, and he actually sweeps away the terrors and sweeps away the injustice of exploitation completely, so that it's not there anymore, and the just will actually stand and be shining like the sun. So God is just, and his actions bring about justice against exploitation coming from the powerful. We'll see this also from Bathsheba, interestingly, in our narrative. So often she's portrayed as a wanton seductress, right? I actually am arguing that rather she's at once representation of a victim, so she of hierarchical kingly exploitation, but also, on the other hand, the representation of the voice of God's justice. So biblical scholars have often portrayed Bathsheba as the seductress, but if we look again at the text in 11:4, we see that she was purifying herself after her period. which was at the end of her menstrual cycle, like she was supposed to do. It says in Leviticus that women were to do that. And actually then we see that the text is portraying her as a virtuous woman who keeps the Torah's cleanliness code. It's also saying that she's a woman that follows Jewish laws according to Leviticus, and showing respect to the hierarchy of the code. But unfortunately, the hierarchical system that she's in did not show her the same respect that she was showing it. I've also heard church sermons talk about Bathsheba as if she was deliberately kind of placing herself in a certain way and in a certain place and time so that David could see her, and so that maybe then she could kind of sleep her way to the top. But just humor me for a moment, right? So she's sitting out there and she thinks, okay, I'm going to get in the bath. And then how long would she have had to be in the bath, just kind of waiting around until hopefully maybe David would have come out and seen her? The only other thing possibly we could surmise from this text would be that maybe she stalked David and just kind of like every day went to her roof and kind of looked around to see if she could find David and see if there was a certain time of day where he would come and stroll along the palace roof. And oh, it's in the evening, I'll go out then. But I will ask you this question too. Is there anything in the text that would say or imply any of this? I would say no, that's not likely. And also actually the focus of the intent of the action in the text is more on David himself rather than on Bathsheba. And the word sent actually in chapter 11, verses 2 to 3 is used multiple times concerning David's actions, again, implying his own great power in the affair, contrasted with her lack of power thereof. So he saw her, right? That's his first action again. He sent someone to inquire about her and got her, and then he finally slept with her. But we see a glimmer of hope in this story too. And a glimmer of God's voice, right? Because Bathsheba uses her voice. We hear it explicitly in chapter 11, verse 5, as she takes action after a series of David's exploitative actions. So David sent for Bathsheba in order to exploit her for his own gain. But Bathsheba, on the other hand, sent to enact justice in the situation when she said to David, I am pregnant. And even though her voice is brief in the passage, we can't really underestimate the power of her voice. So if we look first at Deuteronomy 22, we'll see that the penalty for adultery in Scripture is death. So before Bathsheba tells David, she's got this in the back of her mind. She knows the law, right? Because she was purifying herself from her uncleanliness. So she would also know this passage that adultery meant death for her. And she also knew that she was pregnant. And so she'd be thinking, I want to protect myself, and now I want to protect the life of my unborn child as well, right? So she'd have to be thinking through possible actions, what she could do. And then she would have maybe realized that she had a card to play because David was also implicated. Uriah couldn't be said to be the father because he was gone. So David was definitely implicated in her pregnancy. And also, David would be the one that might have the power to do away with this law that was in the Old Testament saying that death was the penalty. He, as king, could just say, all right, there's not going to be death now. And we see that worked because she didn't die. And so she went ahead and told David. So what do we see finally? We don't see David's repentance, but he did act again. But again, he acted unjustly. He wanted to do a cover-up. Doesn't that sound like the churches, the Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Church? And again, covering up the sin, the sexual sin. And so Bathsheba's husband, when he came home from battle, he tried to get him drunk, and go to sleep with his wife. But when that didn't work, he just said, okay, I think murder is probably the best option now for the next option. That's our plan B, that will work. And so he exploited and finally killed off the subjects who he was supposed to protect. So what is this glimmer of hope that we see, aside from Bathsheba's voice? We also see that what she said actually represents God's voice in the story. So first, through her pregnancy announcement, she's basically essentially saying, David, you messed up, do something about it. And then God actually did the same thing. And so God had the last word finally over David's abuse of power, starting with his displeasure, he says later in verse 26, and also through sending Nathan, the prophet, to go to the most powerful man in the kingdom, in all the kingdom, to confront him. So God is not pleased with King David's exploitation, and he finally demands restoration and justice for those who were exploited and those who were vulnerable and not powerful, when Nathan later tells the story of the lamb to David in his confrontation. So the prophet comes to David, right? And it says that he's sent by the Lord. And that, in verse 21 of chapter 12, is probably the most important part, because it's saying, this is the Lord. He does not condone this kind of exploitation and injustice. So Nathan tells the story of two men. One is rich and by implication powerful. The other one is poor and by implication vulnerable. The rich man has all of these sheep, loads and loads of them. The poor man only has one sheep, but this little sheep actually sits with him, and he eats with him his food, and he drinks out of his own cup, and he sleeps in his arms, and he treats this sheep like his own family, right, or his own child. And what happens? But a traveler actually comes to the rich man to stay with him. And the rich man says, instead of killing one of my many, many sheep, I'm going to go over here to this poor man and just kill his one little sheep that he loves with all of his life. And that's going to be dinner for my traveler, right? So Nathan finishes the story, and David, of course, is incensed, and he's so angry, and he says, I can't believe this. This man deserves to die, right? And then the pinnacle of the entire narrative, Nathan says to David, you are the man. So he says to David, this man in this story that stole from this one man who had this one little lamb is you, and you've sinned. And so David just had not realized that his power had made him into the very person that he said must die, an exploiter. And finally, thank God, he repents and he is restored. So there's a happy ending. So what can we do nowadays to confront exploitation found in government or in religious systems or in other parts of in other systems in the world through sex and other exploitation of men and women and child trafficking and forced labor? What can we do to not be the man that Nathan the prophet is talking about? So Bathsheba spoke out, right, against exploitation and said, I am pregnant. Nathan spoke out and he said, you are the man. And if we go back again to Psalm 73, and we're talking about the psalmist being troubled in spirit about the rich and the powerful exploiting the poor, the psalm actually ends and he says, but as for me, it is good to be near God. I have made the sovereign Lord my refuge. I will tell of all your deeds. So the psalmist is saying, I'm going to use my voice to tell of all of your just deeds, of what you do to sweep away and set in terrors all of the exploitative power of the world. So we can also speak out, and we can also act by volunteering, for example, for one of many organizations that need our help to fight human trafficking or expose forced labor, for example. A21 is an anti-human trafficking organization that helped a girl called Mani, who's from Cambodia, who had an abusive father. And often they lived on one meal a day, and she had to go out begging for food and resorted to begging most of the days. So she wanted a better life in Thailand where she thought she could escape all of that, but once she was there, she ended up being caught up in sexual exploitation. And this is a perfect example of an exploited poor family, probably by the government that originally would have robbed them of land and assets. And A21 actually located them and helped Mani escape her situation and have a free life, free of the exploitation. Also, myself and my husband volunteered and worked for, respectively, Compassion, the organization in Ireland, for over 10 years. And during that time, we just spoke out regularly for children on behalf of them around the world who were in poverty, and also situations of forced labor and trafficking, and helped offer other solutions to people to be able to sponsor children to get needed health care and education to be able to get out of this cycle of exploitation that they were in. Those are just two examples of organizations. There's also many others, and there's a list that I found on salesforce.com that I can provide. If you would like it, ask me and I'll pass it along to you. We can speak out about God's justice towards the unjust and powerful hierarchies. We can also do something, right? So today I really want to challenge you to, as soon as this is over, go to one of these websites, one of these organizations, and find out how you can help victims of hierarchical exploitation. Not just so that we don't become implicit supporters, but we really want to help overcome the problem that God demonstrated in 2 Samuel 11. And we want to come alongside God from Psalm 73 that is sweeping away the terrors of injustice and exploitation in the world. So we can be the Bathsheba and we can be the Nathan in our generation to confront exploitative power where we find it. So thank you and amen.